Alright, so part 5 of the video series, and I've made a few changes to the car since the previous part. I've added spacers to the front. That's because the tires were touching the suspension on the last track day. Um, and I've had to do a stud conversion because of that. Um, and I've also made some changes to the pushrod suspension. Last time the suspension was a little too stiff and it had already taken the car's balance from understeer to oversteer. So I needed to soften the rears to make the balance perfectly neutral. Also, lastly, I've welded my differential. Basically what that means is I've locked my differential and now it's not a differential anymore, it's just two wheels spinning together. And that is a bit of an extreme thing to do. It's temporary in my case. I've done it for now for the CSCS. Later on I'll be moving to an LSD. But yeah, I'll go through all the changes and I'll show you why I did them. Alright, so just to explain a bit about how differentials work and why it's important to have a locking diff for racing. So this is what a differential would basically look like if you cut your car horizontally and look at it from a top view. So this is the propeller shaft coming from the transmission, and that turns the differential. And the differential has, well, these two gears in it, first the pinion and the ring gear. The ring gear spins this way and it spins this cage along with it, which has a series of, they're called spider gears in it. And they're the ones that send torque to each individual axle, and that spins your rear tires. The problem in this is the way the mechanism works. First of all, the reason they need this mechanism is because, let's say you're going around a turn and you're turning your car. The path your tires follow, at least when you're not driving around the track and your tires aren't sliding, the path that your tires follow is pretty much these two circles. So you can see that your inside tire follows a much smaller circle than your outside tire, which is why this tire has to spin slower than the outside tire. And the differential is the thing that allows it to do that. These gears in the differential, they basically, this is just a bigger sketch of these spider gears. And so these two gears are connected with the cage, and the cage spins together with your ring gear in your differential. And these two gears go to each individual axle. And the thing this mechanism allows is that these two gears can spin at different speeds while still getting torque from the engine. But the problem is that the torque split because of this mechanism is always equal. So whatever the torque is going to this wheel, the torque going to this wheel is exactly the same. It has to be because of the way they're linked with this mechanism. So let's say you're driving along and like you push on the car a little bit, and the torque going to this wheel is, let's say, 1,000 Newton meter. The torque going to this wheel will be exactly the same. It has to be 1,000 Newton meter. Now the problem is, let's say this wheel, you go over a patch of snow or something and this wheel loses traction. What happens is that obviously now 1,000 Newton meter can't go to that because it doesn't have the traction to put that torque down. So the torque will significantly reduce. Let's say it goes down to maybe 20 Newton meter or something. The problem with this mechanism now is that the torque going to each individual wheel has to be equal. So the torque going to this wheel will also go down to 20 Newton meter, even if this wheel is completely on a dry patch and it has good traction and everything. It will still be 20 just because of the way it's linked. And if you go on the power more, all that extra rotational energy would just go into spinning this tire that has the lesser traction. So on the track, that's a big problem because when you take corners, your outside tire is where all your weight gets shifted to, and your inside tire gets lifted. If you have a stiffer suspension at the back, that gets even worse because then more of your weight is transferring to your outside tire, and your inside tire gets lifted even more. The problem in my car was after I moved to the pushrod suspension, my rear inside tire was almost getting lifted completely off the ground, taking sharp corners. And I knew that because when I would go on the power, there was almost no power. I was losing drive completely, and all the power was just being wasted spinning the inside tire. So I needed to have an LSD or a welded diff or something to basically lock the diff together. What an LSD now, what a clutch type LSD does is it has these series of clutches between these two gears, and it basically tries to resist the two tires rotating at different speeds. And the more you go on the power, the more these clutches lock together, um, and they resist the tire spinning at different speeds, which will actually send torque to the tire that doesn't have traction, that does have traction, and help your car move faster. Actually, no, the clutches aren't in here. The clutches are actually on the outside. They just connect the gear to the cage. But yeah, they do the same thing as connecting these two gears together. A clutch type diff would have worked really well for me, but the problem was that they don't make clutch type diffs for my car. The only option I had was a helical differential, a torsion diff. What a torsion diff does is it has basically a different mechanism. The gears in that don't look like this. They're worm gears, and the way it works is it works better than this, and the torque split isn't exactly the same, but it has some other ratio of splitting torque. But the problem is that when one tire does get lifted and the torque of one tire does go down to zero, the torque going to the other tire is still zero, and you still lose drive. So the differential will work if you have a softer rear suspension and both your tires are touching the ground, but in my case it probably wouldn't have worked. So that's why I'm welding my diff for now. What welding does is it links both the tires together. So you know for sure that it is going to work because both your tires are now spinning at the same speed. So even if one tire gets lifted completely off the ground, there is still power flowing to this tire because it's physically linked. There is no differential. It's just all connected together. Um, so yeah, but the problem with the welded diff obviously is that when you take turns, especially when you take really sharp turns, your tires are constantly going to be scrubbing the ground, and it's pretty bad. It just ruins the drivability of the car. If you've ever driven one of those SUVs with those locking differentials, and if you've tried to lock them and drive around, it's pretty bad. So that's the problem with it. The other problem on the track is that when you're taking a turn and your tires do want to spin at different speeds, your rear tires, if you force them both to spin at the same speed, they will basically try to push the car straight on, and they will try to resist the car from rotating because obviously they're spinning at the same speed. They want to go in a straight line. So some cars, in most cars actually, that will add understeer. For my case, I'm guessing it's not going to be too significant since in sharp turns my rear and side tires lifted off the ground anyways. So it's more like a three-wheeler. So both the wheels spinning it's probably not going to add too much understeer. So I'm pretty confident in my case it's going to work well. It might not work for all cars because in most cars it will add a lot of understeer, so you might lose track time because of that. So yeah, I'm gonna go with the welded diff for now, but after September I'm probably gonna swap to the LSD, and I'll see how that one goes. Now before I show you how to remove the differential on your car, I just want to give out a word of warning. Working underneath your car is really dangerous, and whenever you plan on doing that, make sure to use plenty of axle stands and make the car rest on the axle stands, just not put them under and still keep your car resting on the hydraulic jack. Because these hydraulic jacks are pretty dangerous. The thing is that it's just a hydraulic holding the weight of the car up, and hydraulics just have these rubber rings in them that hold the pressure. And if the rubber cracks, the hydraulic is coming straight down. So it's really dangerous. Don't rely on that. Always use axle stands. If you have one of these safer jacks with this locking mechanism, these are better to use. So what I usually do is I lift the car up using the two hydraulic jacks and I put the axle stands under it. And what I also do is I slide a tire under the car, just because if the jacks do fail and if the car does slide off the axle stands, there is something holding the car up and the car just doesn't come down completely. Because this is pretty dangerous. If you're not comfortable with doing this, I don't recommend doing it. People have died working under their cars, so it's a pretty dangerous thing. Now I'm underneath the car and I was just having a look at the differential and what tools I will need to get it out. And it seems I have to remove a fair bit of stuff to get it out. It is a pretty big differential, and there's two bolts at the back. They're at the back side of this, mounted to the subframe, and there's a bracket at the front over here, and there's 4 bolts at the bracket. There's two of them are on the other side, and I'm guessing I'll have to remove those bolts first, and then also I'll have to remove the bracket probably, because the differential is going through the bracket and it's connected on the flex joint over here. And then I'll also have to remove the axles. So before I do that, I'll also have to drain the differential fluid. This plug over here is actually the fill plug. That's where you fill the fluid in from. The drain plug is on the other side. That's the drain plug over there. And you know which one's the drain plug because the drain plug is at the lowest point of the differential, and the fill plug is a little higher than the drain plug. And after that, I'm guessing I might have to remove the exhaust as well, because this is one side of the exhaust, that's the other side. The differential is sitting right in between those, so I'm not sure if there's going to be enough space to take the differential out from between the exhausts. So yeah, it seems like a pretty difficult job. Not the ideal thing to be doing at home. Now, before I could undo the bolts, the two bolts at the back of the differential over there, I had to lower my entire subframe a little bit. So I did that by loosening these two subframe bolts. One is on this side, one is all the way on the other side, and that drops the entire subframe down by a few. I would say I dropped it by about a centimeter, and now I can finally get my torque wrench on there. I'm not using a breaker bar because my breaker bar still doesn't fit, but fortunately now my torque wrench does fit over there. So for removing the exhaust, or one side of the exhaust, what I did was well, first of all, I had to take out this rubber mount that attaches there. Then I had to disconnect the nut over there that connects the two exhausts together. And also I had to disconnect that flange over there. That was really easy. And this other rubber mount. I didn't disconnect the mount itself, I disconnected the part those two bolts that go in there. And right now the exhaust is just hanging on with this axle stand. It's better to put an axle stand in place when you're unbolting all this, because it's a pretty heavy exhaust and you might not be able to lift it, because when you undo the last thing that's holding it, the whole thing is gonna fall down. So it's better to place an axle stand or something just to hold it in place. So I finally have the differential out, but I didn't record the whole thing when I was removing everything. That's because it was a difficult job. But I'll just go over everything I had to remove to get this off. So I removed one side of the exhaust. It would have been better if I took out the entire exhaust. It would have made the job easier, but my bolts on the flange ahead of the resonator, they were a little rusty, and I didn't want to take the risk opening those in case I broke them. Other than that, most of this side of the suspension had to come off. You can see that, oh yeah, this is off. This lower control arm, it's off from here. Most of those other control arms are off too. The only control arm left in place is this one. I had to do that so I could move this wheel hub far enough to pull out the axle. And what else? Oh, the bracket that the differential mounts on, I loosened the bolt on one side, but I took this one out entirely so I could pivot the whole thing down to take that off. This axle I just left in place, and also everything for that side of the suspension, I left that in place just so I don't have to do too much work to put everything back together, because once one axle and one side of everything is out, you can slide the differential this way to take it out of this axle, and that way you can take it out. The differential is a little heavy, so if you have two people, it's easier to take it off. For one person, it's a little too heavy to lift. Oh, another thing, the flex joint over here has these metal inserts that go into the part of the differential where it mounts. The way to take these out, the best way I found was use a chisel that doesn't have an edge that's too sharp to damage the rubber, and put the chisel right over here, right at this edge, and hammer it so the pin breaks free of the differential, and then that way you can remove the flex joint and take that off. Okay, now that I have the differential out, I can start disassembling it. And the first thing I'm going to do is remove this back cover. It's held in place by these 8 bolts. Alright, so now I took the back cover off the differential. And the way I did that was, here's these 2 holes that they've left in the differential. One is this one. I inserted a pin in this and I hammered it from the back so I could, and this is obviously after removing the 8 bolts. I hammered it from the back so it would push the plate off and remove the silicone. There's actually 2 of these. One hole is over here, but I just hammered one of them and it came off, so I didn't have to use the other one. Okay, so now I cleaned most of the gear oil out using alcohol, and the reason I cleaned most of the gear oil is because when I'm going to be welding this is going to heat up, and the oil creates a lot of smoke and it's not good when you're welding something. Now before I start welding my actual differential, I'll practice on this scrap differential that I have. It's from a Mazda, so I don't really care about it. But that's because if I screw up on that differential, that's the only differential I have, and I'll have to end up replacing it. So it's best to practice first to make sure that you'll get the weld right. Alright, now I applied 1 layer of weld on it, just a little bit. I'm not welding it on the actual gears, I'm just welding it on the side. This is just to see how the weld sticks to these metals. But yeah, that's just 1 layer. I'm guessing I'll have to apply 2 or 3 layers to make it thick enough, because all of this metal is pretty thick metal and there's a lot of force going through it. Just look at how thick the cage is over here. So my weld has to be something like that. It has to be really thick. So that's several layers of welding, I think 2 or 3, to make it strong enough to hold. Oh, and just to tell you what parts I have to weld. I have to weld all this section over here to hold this gear to the cage. I'll have to weld a little in between these gears, and I'll also weld these gears to the cage. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to reach that gear over there, so I'm just going to leave that. I'm just going to make these welds strong enough so that even if I leave that one out, it will still hold. And and the other thing is I have to be really careful not to splatter any of my welding on the splines in there where the axle sits, because the thing is, if I get a whole bunch of welding on that, my axle won't be able to slide in and it will just cause problems. Like if you can see over here, there's a lot of junk that flies around when you're welding. I'll have to clean all of that off. I'll try to put it at an angle so most of the welding splatter falls out of the differential. But all of it that goes in, I'll have to clean it off because there's oil inside this and the oil is circulating. So you can't have any welding splatter or anything else on it that will circulate around the differential and break something. Okay, so I just did the first weld. The weld is sinking into the metal pretty nicely, but as you can see, it's a pretty thin weld right now. I'll need to do this. I just cleaned it up with a wire brush, and I'm probably going to need to do this 1 or 2 more times to make it thick enough. So this is what the weld looks like after applying 2 layers of welding, and it's already getting a little bulky and it's looking a little ugly. I don't think I'll be able to get a 3rd layer on here because my MIG welder is just not going to be strong enough to apply another layer of weld, because the thicker the weld gets, the more heat you need to apply the next layer. But I think this is good enough. I'll just do all the other welds now and make them the same. And also then rotate this thing around and do the other side. Okay, now I've cleaned the entire differential. I tried cleaning it with alcohol, but there was just so many splinters inside that I finally had to clean it with water. The thing is, the problem with cleaning it with water is that water will rust the gears. But the thing is, yeah, I'm gonna dry it as soon as possible so it doesn't get too rusty. And after that, I'm gonna prime it with some differential fluid, the needle bearings in there, and this ring gear, and also try to get some fluid back in the bearing that connects to the propeller shaft. But after that, yeah, then I'll just apply some silicone around the edge and close the differential, then mount everything back in the car and then fill it with fluid again. Alright, now the diff is closed again. I've already applied the gasket maker, torqued all the nuts. Now I have to pick this up and put this back in the car. I called a friend over to help me do that because the diff is too heavy, I can't lift it myself. I'm going to use a jack anyways to lift it up, but still, it's a little too heavy for one person to do, so it's better to have another person. Alright, so now I'm putting the differential back in. I have to say, as hard as this differential was to get out, putting it back in was even harder. Now I'm just bolting everything back in. I've bolted the suspension for this side in, and now I'm going to raise this bracket back up so it goes in this hole over here, and then I'll put that bolt in. But yeah, all in all, a really difficult job. And once all of this is done, I'm going to remove the bolt for the filler plug over here and fill in some differential fluid. So here's the trick I use for filling the differential fluid. I made a hole in the top of my gear oil container, and I inserted this rubber tube, and I just made it tight so it doesn't leak any air. Then I made another small hole where I inserted this pin. This is what they use for filling basketballs. And I have a bicycle pump over here, so when I pump air, you'll see the oil will start coming out there. And the other end of the tube, right now it's over here, but I'll insert that in my differential, and that's gonna keep filling fluid. Right now I'm just gonna let some fluid run through, so if there's any dirt in the pipe, you can get rid of that. Now I've inserted the tube in my differential, and it's slowly gonna keep filling fluid. And when I see fluid dripping down from the differential, I'll know that it's full. Then I'll release the air pressure and I'll put the fill plug back in. I'll just have to sit here and wait, and usually it takes a few minutes for it to fill up, and then I'll be done with this. And one final change I've made to the front of the car is that I've added these studs over here and the spacer. The reason I went from using wobble bolts to now studs is because wobble bolts only come in one size, and that size wasn't working for me after I added these spacers, because what spacers do is they move your wheel away from the hub, and if your bolt isn't long enough, you can't use that bolt anymore. And I had to add spacers because on the last track day my tire was touching this part of the suspension. I've already primered it now, so that if the tire touches it again, there will be a mark there and I'll know that it was touching. But the problem was that you can find wobble bolts, but you can't find wobble nuts, and with studs you need nuts. So what I've done is I took these normal lug nuts that were cone shaped at first when I bought them, but I cut that cone section off, and I took this washer off of one of the wobble nuts, and what this will do is when I put this washer on here, will basically work like a wobble nut rather than a wobble bolt. So it's pretty much like I'm gonna put this lug nut on like this, and now this washer can move around, and it's pretty much the same thing as a wobble bolt, but a lug nut. Yeah, so hopefully this should work fine and my tire won't be touching the suspension anymore. Now, one final change I made to the pushrod suspension was that I moved the springs down to soften the rear suspension, but I'm not going to talk about it too much in this video because it's getting long enough anyways. I'll make another separate video on suspension setup later on. Oh shit. Okay, so I have my rockers out, and I'm just cutting this weld off with an angle grinder, and I'm going to move this whole thing down, which means that the coil spring is going to mount lower down, just like I've done it on this side. And this will change my spring rate from, well, the equivalent of 27k, which it is right now, and it will go down to about 19k, 20 or 19, which hopefully is going to be good enough for correcting the balance of the car. So after doing all these changes, I did drive the car for a bit on the streets, Um, and you might probably be wondering, how does it feel like driving on the welded diff? And to be honest, I couldn't push it to the full limit because when I was putting my axles back in after welding the differential, I messed up on one of the parts and I broke my reluctor ring. That's the ring that goes on the axle, and it gives a magnetic signal to the wheel speed sensor so your car can sense how fast the wheel is spinning. I think I broke one of those while putting the axle back in, and now the problem is when I push the car too much, it kicks into limp mode every time. But I've still driven the car on the streets, and I felt what the balance is like and how it accelerates. And the welded diff has made a big difference. Now, for the first time, I can actually put the power down while cornering in this car. And the welded diff is a bit of a hassle when driving slowly. When you're taking corners, especially in a parking lot, it scrubs the rear tires an awful lot. I switched my rear tires onto my winter tires because they have less traction. With the slicks, it was just scrubbing an awful lot, and it was just painful driving it. With the winters, it's better, so I guess I'll keep the winters for driving the car to the track. But other than that, yeah, I think the changes are pretty positive. The changes I made to the pushrod suspension are really positive. Now the car's balance is almost perfectly neutral, but I'll talk about all the suspension setup in a different video later on. For now, the car is looking good. I just have to deal with that wheel speed sensor issue. And once that's fixed, hopefully I'll head to the track and do a track day and see how much lap times I gain because of all these changes.